Okay, so this video we're going to start looking at ecosystems, okay, and some characteristics of tropical rainforests. So students need to be aware, first of all, what makes an ecosystem an ecosystem, something called the nutrient cycle, the characteristics of rainforests, and finally, how animals and plants have adapted to survive in rainforests. So first of all, lots of keywords to be aware of. Ecosystem is a community of plants and animals that interact with each other. A producer is basically an organism that produces its own food through photosynthesis, otherwise known as a plant. We're consumers because we consume things, okay? We gain energy by doing that. A decomposer breaks down organic matter. Think of bacteria or fungi, okay? As examples of decomposers, dung beetles might be another one, maggots, okay? Components of an ecosystem can be split into biotic and abiotic. Biotic, just think biology. In biology, students study about plants and animals, so biotic just means living things, and abiotic means non-living. So biotic might be plants and animals, abiotic could be the soil, it could be the climate, it could be rainfall, it could be a rock, okay? And then food chains and food webs, which we'll look at now. So this is an example of like a woodland food web, and from this students should be able to create a food chain, okay, which should always start with a producer such as this oak tree, which gets consumed by the primary consumer, which would be a squirrel, and that gets consumed by a secondary consumer like a fox, okay. You might have heard of top of the food chain or an apex predator. So you might argue the fox could well be an apex predator here. And then we've got our decomposers are going to break down any of these animals or plants that die, like fungi or an earthworm, okay? To be aware, students need to know, why the arrows are pointing towards the thing that's doing the eating. And it's not to show that, it's to show the transfer of energy. Why do we eat? To get energy. Where does energy come from? Plants. Where does that come from? The sun. Okay, all starts with the sun. If we didn't have the sun, we would not be a thriving planet. So all the energy goes into the plants due to photosynthesis, and then when things start consuming that energy is passed through. But this will reduce. So I always say, imagine this tree has 100 kilojoules of energy. When this squirrel takes that, it's not going to take 100% of that. Okay, so there won't be 100 kilojoules of energy in the squirrel, and then that squirrel will move, which uses energy. It will excrete poo, which uses energy. It will breathe, respiration, that uses energy. So by the time this fox, we look at his energy levels, it's not going to be as high, okay? Again, the fox is not going to eat the whole squirrel. It might not eat the bone, for example, okay? So now this might be down to like 50 kilojoules. So it shows the transfer of energy. This is biology as well, guys, so students need to know this in science. So plant-based diets are absolutely where we should be heading, because we're more guaranteed to get that full energy rather than going through a consumer as well, okay? So just to be aware. Then we have the nutrient cycle. Now, this looks really complicated, so I'm going to break it down for you. I just want you to concentrate on these three elements. This is basically Lion King, right? Circle of life, yeah? We have our biomass, which is our plants and animals. That's us. Plants, animals. When that dies, okay, it becomes litter. Think of litter like people throw litter on the ground. So when you're kicking up the leaves in the forest, that is litter, okay? It's called litter. The decomposers like the worms, the maggots, the fungi will break that litter down, and all the nutrients that were once inside the biomass, the plants, the animals, which are now in the litter, they get released into the soil. Okay, and then the roots of those new plants in the forest absorb those nutrients, and then the cycle starts again. Okay, so this is called the nutrient cycle. All right, I think in the Lion King, they're like, was it the antelope eats the grass, the lion eats the antelope, and then we die, and then, it all starts again, doesn't it? Yeah, I'm sure Mufasa did a better job than me. How does the nutrients get there in the first place? We've got our inputs, which are here. They come through rain, okay? So if the clouds have evaporated some nutrients, when it rains, it goes back into the nutrient cycle. And the weathering of rock can release minerals and nutrients as well. But those nutrients can also leave the ecosystem, okay? They can wash away from the surface. So if we have lots of rain, for example, it can wash away that layer of nutrients. This is why deforestation is bad as well, because the roots aren't there to bind the soil. So when it rains, it washes away the nutrients and can actually lead to desertification. That's why the Sahara Desert is spreading. and also any rainwater that seeps or infiltrates into the ground, and then we have through flow where the rain washes through the soil. That's called leaching, so the nutrients can leach away as well. Okay, so students need to be aware of where the nutrients are stored, how they're transferred, okay, how they get in, how they get out. Okay, this is an example. Students need to know about the climate of tropical rainforests. It's obviously hot all year round because it's on the equator, and there are large amounts of rainfall, 10 times as much as what you'd get, okay, in the UK, for example. Crazy amounts of rain. Generally, bars represent precipitation, which is the posh word for rain, hail, sleet, or snow. We'd have to look at this axis to find out, for example, in March, there are over 300 millimeters of rain or precipitation, and temperature, we look on this axis over here and say, it's anywhere all year round is between 25 and 30 degrees. We might acknowledge that there's a bit of a dry season, okay, in the summer months, but I wouldn't call them summer months because they don't really have seasons on the equator. So I would say between June and November is a dry season, okay, something like that. We have discussed in a previous session why it's hot at the equator and why it rains a lot. But just to remind you, this is what we were talking about. This is that hairdryer on the back of my daughter's head. It's not a gun, it's a hairdryer. Okay, the sun's energy is more concentrated in a smaller area. Okay, so they feel it more on the equator, whereas it's more spread out. Okay, these are the same width, but you can see it's hitting a larger area because of the spherical shape of the Earth. Okay, these rays also have more atmosphere to travel through because of the shape. So that also helps to just reduce a bit of that energy. Okay, so more spread out, more concentrated. Nothing to do with the distance from the sun. That is inaccurate. And because it's hot on the equator, hot air rises. We talked about this earlier as well. And as it rises up, it cools and condenses to form clouds, and then we get heavy convectional rainfall. This happens on the equator every day pretty much, and it's also why at the end of a hot summer's day, we often get a big thunderstorm, or if you've been to a tropical holiday destination, quite often you get these big powerful thunderstorms in the afternoon. And that's because all day long that hot air is rising. And you can see it when you look down a road, it's like a mirage. It looks like there's water on the surface, but that's that hot air rising up. Okay, it cools and condenses and forms clouds as it goes right up into the sky where it's colder, and eventually it returns to water vapor and we get raindrops. That's called convectional rain, and these make perfect conditions for plant growth, okay, such as plants like the ones on the board here. Now, students need to understand how these plants have adapted to survive in a rainforest. These are called lianas. Think Tarzan or George of the Jungle if you're younger. Swinging on these, okay? These are very clever plants, and they basically are vine-like plants, otherwise known as woody creepers, that climb the taller trees to get to the sunlight. So typically, the forest floor of a rainforest, because it's in layers, only receives 3% of light. Okay, because the canopy layer, which is the thick layer that you can see here, acts almost like a massive marquee or like an umbrella. So it's very dark, and plants obviously need sunlight to survive. So they're trying to get up, okay? So they climb. They climb because they're alive. They climb the taller trees to break through the canopy to get to the sunlight for photosynthesis so they can survive. Buttress roots have a couple of different adaptations. Some of these can be massive. Google these. They can be bigger than, a 6-foot man, okay, or woman. And they've adapted, first of all, because they're really wide, so they help to support the tallest trees. The tallest trees in the rainforest are called emergents, and they emerge through the canopy. If you were underwater, you'd be submerged, and then you emerge out of the water, okay? And also, they're very shallow, which means they don't go deep into the soil. And that is because all the nutrients are close to the surface. And they're close to the surface because there's heavy rain. And the rain washes the nutrients away. Okay, so any nutrients tend to be on the surface. There's lots of decaying matter as well because it's so hot and humid. So all that rotting litter, okay, the plants and the animals that have died, that's where the nutrients are. So they don't need to go deep down, okay? These are drip tip leaves. Too much water is actually bad for the plants. So if you had a normal leaf that's kind of sat like that, every time the rain hits it, it might break the leaf, okay, and damage it if it sits on there. So they're designed to tip, okay, and they've got a little tip at the end. So the water drips off the tip. That's why they're called drip tip leaves. And the water will go down to the roots where it can still benefit without breaking the leaf. And the final plant adaptation are these buttress roots. Sorry, ignore me. What's happened there? That should say emergence, apology. The emergent tree themselves they're an adaptation. They have grown so large to push through the canopy, okay, again, to get to that sunlight for photosynthesis. Equally, animals need to adapt as well. So we have a poison dart frog, for example. It's got many adaptations, including kind of sticky pads on its feet so it can climb. But the best one to talk about is the fact that it's very brightly coloured. Think any reptile that's this sort of colour, it screams, I'm poisonous, don't eat me. And it might not actually be poisonous, but you're not going to go near it, okay? So that's going to warn off predators. Poison dart frog or poison arrow frog, for example. Then we've got a sloth, which has designed in such a way, or adapted in such a way that, one, it's got these larger claws. That's not for swiping away. It's not a very aggressive animal. It's so it can cling on to branches and hang there for long periods of time. It's got almost like ribbon-like muscle tissue. It's very weak, okay, so it needs to be able to hang there. It hasn't got the strength to do that. They've also, very cleverly, got this angled fur. And it's a bit like the drip tip leaf. It's designed so that the water drips off the fur. They're also very slow moving. If you've seen Zootropolis, you'll understand. And that is so that they conserve their energy. Okay. A toucan has a large, strong beak to break into nuts for eating. And a flying squirrel has flaps of skin. Think of bingo wings, but don't write that in your exam. Flaps of skin, so it can glide away from predators and keep off that forest floor. Okay. Finally, in terms of application, here's an example question. Study figure 6, which I'll show you is here. It's 2 different parts. Information about the climate and vegetation of tropical rainforests. Suggest how plants are adapted to the climate in tropical rainforests. Use figure 6 and your own understanding. So again, bug the question, box the command word, suggest how, give me reasons for. Underline the focus, plants, adapted, climate, rainforests, figure 6, own understanding. Glance at the mark scheme. 6 marks, right. I know that means I've got to do 2 paragraphs, okay? So how am I going to structure this? I've got to talk about the figure, okay? They have not given me this climate graph for no reason. They want me to quote it. They want me to say, well, rainforests have lots of rain. Okay, for example, in March, there's 350 millimeters of rain. Plants have adapted to survive to these conditions. For example, if you look in the photo, you can see drip tip leaves. Okay, you can see buttress roots, which are designed to collect the nutrients from the shallow surface. And the nutrients are on the surface because of that heavy rain, because it washes the nutrients away that are deeper down into the soil. Okay, what else can you talk about? There are large amounts of sunlight with warm temperatures between 25 and 30 degrees. Leaves are specially adapted to be large surface areas so they can absorb as much sunlight as possible because it's dark. Underneath the canopy, only 3% of light gets down, okay? These emergents themselves and any lianas that are climbing them are going to push through that canopy as well, okay? So we're using the climate graph and the photo. We don't want to be talking about other things. Certainly don't want to be talking about animals because the question was about plants. So we've really got to take the time, guys, to read the question, bug it, box, underline, glance, and plan your answer. Just 30 seconds, 2 paragraphs, 1 on this, 1 on that, okay? Maybe even draw annotations pointing to these buttress roots, okay? The liana, okay? A certain month, a certain temperature, because then you're going to remember to talk about that in your exam. If you don't use these figures, you are limiting your marks, okay? That's it for this session. Final session is about deforestation. See you there.